Part 1, The Number. Nobody had beaten the number in 19 years, and in about 6 weeks, everybody at that table was going to find out why nobody ever would. The Coalition Military Academy on Station Cathis had been producing officers for 160 years. Its graduation rate sat at 63%. The most selective program in the outer systems, its alumni holding command posts across 12 active fleets, its name carrying weight in every briefing room from the core to the rim. Officially, the Academy placed cadets on performance alone, species blind. That was the policy, printed in the founding charter, repeated in every orientation speech for a century and a half. What the policy didn't account for was the quiet hierarchy that grows inside any institution old enough to have traditions, the accumulated sense of which species had historically ranked where, who the program had been built to develop, and who was still, in the eyes of the room, the new addition to the guest list. Humans had held coalition membership for 31 years. They'd been sending cadets to the academy for 19 of them. In that time, 11 had graduated. Most had washed out in the first year, unable to match the raw physical baselines of species built for higher gravity or the tactical fluency of species raised inside centuries-old military traditions. The ones who made it through had done so quietly, competently, without ever climbing near the top of a class ranking. Humans, the informal consensus went, were adequate. Reliable. Not exceptional. This year's class had exactly one human cadet. His name was Rin Calder. 22 years old, out of a frontier settlement called Halvern's Reach on the far edge of Coalition space, a cluster of pressurized domes and mining rigs strung along an asteroid belt nobody in the Corps had ever heard of, 3 jumps past the last supply corridor with any real security presence. His admissions file had been read twice by the intake officer assigned to process it, not because it was thin, but because the first pass had produced numbers that didn't seem to fit the birth date attached to them. 4 years of active frontier service before he'd even applied. That alone was unusual. Most cadets arrived straight out of pre-academy tracks, 18 or 19 years old, with training records and simulation scores but no real operational history. Rin's file had a service record with engagement counts high enough that the intake officer had flagged it for verification before signing off on his admission, because the raw numbers, taken at face value, seemed less like a personnel record and more like a clerical error. The verification came back confirmed. Every line of it. The intake officer had sat with that confirmation for a long moment before forwarding the file, because she understood, in a way that most of the academy would not for another 6 weeks, exactly what kind of student they were about to receive. Rin never brought any of it up. He arrived on the transport shuttle with a single duffel bag, found his quarters in the Frontier Division dormitory wing, and reported to his first class 4 minutes early, which put him ahead of every other cadet in his cohort. He carried himself like someone entirely focused on the coursework in front of him and entirely uninterested in the social architecture growing up around him. The informal seating arrangements at meals, the study groups that formed along species lines, the low-grade tribal sorting that happens in any group of young people thrown together under pressure. The social architecture was very interested in him. It started small, the way these things do. A few cadets in his dormitory wing noted that he didn't attend the evening social hours in the common lounge, that he spent his free periods in the training hall instead, running solo drills long after the scheduled sessions ended. A few noted that his physical assessment scores, while not exceptional in any single category, were unnervingly consistent, never the highest number on the board, but never far from it either, in every discipline, every time. A few noted that when instructors called on him in class, his answers came fast and precise, delivered without the hedging or performative uncertainty that other cadets use to soften a wrong guess. He was either right or he said he didn't know. There was no middle setting. None of this, on its own, would have mattered. Competence without visible struggle reads, to a certain kind of observer, as arrogance waiting for the right moment to be punctured. And the academy, for all its official neutrality, had never quite lost the instinct to test what it didn't yet understand. Part 2, The Seminar. It came to a head in the third week, in Instructor Vask's Combat Doctrine Seminar, 12 cadets around a discussion table, the kind of class built around cadets testing each other's arguments in real time rather than simply absorbing lecture material. Vask was a Darini, a species built low and broad with a long institutional memory. He had taught the seminar for 11 years and had developed, in that time, a reputation for letting discussions run exactly as long as they needed to before intervening, never a moment sooner. The topic that day was asymmetric engagement doctrine, how smaller, less resourced forces achieved outcomes against numerically or technologically superior opposition. It was, on paper, an abstract discussion of historical case studies and theoretical frameworks. It became something else the moment Cadet Ilura-san decided to make it personal. Ilura was a railcar, 4th year, current top of the class rankings, and widely regarded, by instructors and cadets alike, as the strongest tactical mind the Academy had produced in a decade. She had earned that reputation honestly, through 3 years of top marks and a command presence that made underclassmen quiet down when she entered a room. She had also, in 3 years, never once had that reputation seriously challenged. She brought up the human question with the timing of someone who had rehearsed it. For the sake of the discussion, she said, addressing the room in a way that made it clear the address had one specific target, it might help to establish a baseline. What different species actually bring to asymmetric engagement, combat experience as a reference point. A pause, timed precisely, the kind of pause built for an audience. What would the kill count be for a typical Earth soldier at Calder's stage of service? Just for context. A few smiles went around the table, the particular kind that shows up in rooms where a hierarchy is being enforced and the audience has already picked a side, waiting to see the joke land before they laugh out loud. Instructor Vask, at the head of the table, said nothing. He'd been waiting for this exact moment since the second week of the term, when he'd first pulled Rin's operational file out of simple professional curiosity and found himself reading it 3 times in a row. Rin looked at Ilura with a pair of steady light brown eyes that Vask had noted, over 3 weeks, never changed with what was happening around him, only with what he himself was thinking. He didn't look angry. He didn't look embarrassed. He looked, if anything, mildly interested, the way a person looks when someone asks a question they've genuinely never been asked before and are trying to figure out the most useful way to answer it. That's a fair question, Rin said, and he meant it, there was no edge in his voice at all. You want the Frontier Service number, or the total? The smiles held, though a few flickered with the first hint of uncertainty. Ilura answered with the patience of someone setting up a punchline she was confident about. Let's say total. For context. Rin gave her a number. The smiles stopped, not all at once, but the way a wave breaks, closest to the impact first, spreading outward as each cadet ran the math in their head and tried to decide whether that figure was even physically plausible for a 22-year-old from an outer frontier settlement. A Vantar cadet near the end of the table actually laughed once, sharply, before catching herself, the sound of someone who assumed it had to be a joke and only realized halfway through the laugh that nobody else was laughing with her. That's not possible, Ilura said, considerably less patient now, her voice sharper by half a register. Verifications in my admissions file, Rin said. If you want the operational breakdown, the engagements are all documented. Most of them have footage. Instructor Vask spoke for the first time since the question had been asked, and there was something in his voice that the cadets who knew him well would have recognized as barely contained anticipation. The footage is in the Academy's operational archive. I've already pulled the relevant files. He looked around the table, letting his gaze rest on each cadet in turn before continuing. Since we're discussing asymmetric doctrine, actual case studies seem appropriate. Wouldn't you agree, Cadet-san? Ilura's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course, instructor. Vask hit the display control. The classroom wall became a screen. Part 3, The Archive. What followed ran 40 minutes, and Vask had built the sequence carefully over the preceding weeks, because he understood, better than anyone else in the room yet did, that the file wasn't a list of impressive numbers. It was a complete education in the exact subject the seminar was supposed to be teaching, delivered by someone who had lived it instead of read about it. The first case study was dated 3 years and 8 months prior. Halvern's Reach, the mining settlement Ryn had grown up in, had been raided by a Skarn scavenger fleet, 3 armed transports and an escort cruiser, drawn by rumors of an unshielded ore refinery with minimal defenses. The settlement's actual defense force consisted of 11 part-time militia, a handful of repurposed mining lasers retrofitted for point defense, and Ryn Calder, 18 years old at the time, 6 months into what should have been an unremarkable posting on the settlement's perimeter watch. The footage was not dramatic in the way that Academy training simulations were dramatic. It had the specific grain and shake of a field recorder mounted on a militia helmet, the ambient hiss of a suit's internal comm, the flat unglamorous visual weight that only comes from something that was never staged for anyone's benefit. There was no music. There was no narration. There was just a young man moving through a corridor of stacked ore containers, calling out range estimates to a comm channel in a voice that stayed level even as the audio picked up the whine of incoming fire striking metal 30 meters away. Vask paused the footage at intervals to narrate the tactical situation, and as he did, the room's silence deepened by degrees. The refinery had no fallback position. Evacuation would have meant abandoning 400 civilians in the residential domes behind the perimeter, domes with no independent defense of their own. Communication with the nearest coalition patrol had been cut in the opening minutes of the raid, a standard scavenger tactic. There had been no possibility of extraction, no possibility of reinforcement, and no acceptable outcome that involved falling back. This is what the doctrine calls a fixed engagement, Vask said, freezing the footage on a wide shot of the ore container corridor. No retreat, no support, numerical and material disadvantage on every axis. The textbook answer is that a defending force in this position should expect to lose the position. The question this case study asks is, what does a defending force actually do when losing the position is not an acceptable outcome? He resumed the footage. By the fourth case study. A boarding action 11 months later, when a Skarn vessel had attempted to take the refinery's ore processing platform directly rather than risk another ground assault, the classroom had gone completely silent. Not the silence of boredom. The silence of 12 cadets and 1 instructor watching something actively rewrite their understanding of the conversation they thought they'd been having 20 minutes earlier. The footage from the boarding action was harder to watch, not because it was more violent, but because it was more intimate, helmet cam footage from inside a pressurized corridor barely wide enough for 2 people to pass, the kind of close-quarters engagement that gave no room for tactics beyond raw decision speed and physical commitment. Ryn's voice on the recording was still level. His movements, even compressed and grainy through low-bandwidth suit recording, had a quality that several cadets at the table, cadets who had trained in close-quarters combat simulations for 3 years, recognized immediately as fundamentally different from what they had been taught. Not more aggressive. More economical. Every motion serving exactly one purpose, with nothing left over for display. By the 8th case study, Illyra wasn't smiling anymore. She was watching the screen with the expression of someone running a calculation that was going to outlast the class period, her arms crossed, her weight shifted forward in her seat in a posture that Vask, watching her from the head of the table, recognized as genuine engagement for the first time in 3 years of teaching her. She had stopped performing for the room. She was actually paying attention. The 9th case study was the one Vask had saved for last, and it was the one he'd built the entire session around. It was dated 14 months prior, and it did not involve combat at all, not directly. It was recovered footage and audio from an emergency evacuation, when a coolant failure in the refinery's primary reactor had triggered a cascading radiation leak with an estimated 11 minutes before the reactor breached containment entirely and took the residential domes with it. Ryn, on perimeter watch 3 kilometers away when the alarm hit, had been the closest armed personnel to the reactor structure. The evacuation protocol called for immediate withdrawal of all non-essential personnel to minimum safe distance. Rin's file recorded that he had instead gone in, alone, to manually override a jammed containment valve that the automated systems could not reach and that no remote system had the mechanical leverage to force. The footage showed him working the valve by hand in a suit rated for radiation exposure levels well below what the reactor chamber was producing, his voice on the comm reporting his exposure readings to the settlement's medical staff at regular intervals in the same flat comm register he'd used calling out enemy positions in the boarding action footage. The valve gave way at the 9-minute 40-second mark, 80 seconds before the automated failsafe would have triggered a full containment breach. 412 people had been in the residential domes at the time. Vask let that footage run in full, uncut, all the way to the moment Rin walked out of the reactor chamber under his own power and was met by medical staff who immediately put him on a stretcher he did not, according to the file, actually need. When the case study ended, Vask killed the display, and for a moment nobody in the room said anything at all. Part 4, The Correction. Asymmetric engagement doctrine, Vask said finally, into the silence, is best studied not as theory, but as practice. The question of what different species bring to that context, he looked at Illyra with the precise neutrality of a good instructor, giving her no exit and no accusation, simply a mirror, is an excellent one. And the answer, as we've just seen, is usually more complicated than a baseline assumption. He let that sit for a second before continuing. I'd also add, since we're being precise about doctrine, that everything you just watched happened under conditions that violate almost every principle we teach in this seminar about sound tactical positioning. No fallback. No reinforcement. No acceptable withdrawal. Cadet Calder did not win these engagements by applying superior doctrine. He won them because the alternative to winning was 400 dead civilians, and some outcomes are simply not survivable to accept. I want every cadet in this room to sit with that distinction, because it is the actual subject of this course, and it is not a distinction that shows up cleanly in a simulation. Class ended a few minutes later. Cadets filed out in a cluster that was quieter than usual, several of them glancing back at Rin's seat on their way past. Not to speak, but with the specific body language of people who had just updated an assessment and hadn't yet decided what the new one was. Illyra stopped at the door. She stood there a moment with the look of someone who had asked a question expecting one particular answer and gotten an entire education instead, turning something over in her mind before she could make herself say it out loud. The Frontier Service number, she said finally, to the room in general, like she was finishing a thought she'd started 3 weeks earlier, and the total are different. By about 60, Rin said. No edge in it. Just a fact, offered the same way he'd offered everything else that afternoon. She left without saying anything further, but Vask noted, watching her go, that she paused in the corridor outside just long enough to look back through the doorway once before continuing on. Rin gathered his notes and the training spear he'd brought in for the afternoon's practical component, and looked at Instructor Vask, still seated at the head of the table. You already had the footage pulled, Rin said. It wasn't a question. Since the second week, Vask said. I was just waiting for the right discussion topic to justify using it. Rin held his gaze a moment. Something moved across his face. Not satisfaction, not pride, nothing that would have looked like vindication on anyone else. Something quieter than either. Asymmetric engagement, he said. It's always been the most interesting doctrine to me. Wish I'd learned it from a book instead. He picked up the spear and walked out. Vask stayed at the table a while longer. He opened the class performance record and, under Cadet Calder, wrote 3 words. Already teaching it. Then he closed the file and sat for a moment longer than the empty room strictly required, thinking about 11 graduates in 19 years, and wondering how many of them had walked through this academy carrying files nobody had thought to read twice. Part 5, The Practical. Word travels fast in a population of 300 cadets living in close quarters, and by the following morning, most of the Academy had heard some version of what had happened in Vask's seminar. The version that circulated was, predictably, less accurate than the footage itself, numbers inflated in some retellings, downplayed skeptically in others by cadets who hadn't seen it and assumed exaggeration. But the core fact traveled intact and unavoidable. The quiet human in Frontier Division had a service record that made half the fourth years look like they'd spent their pre-academy years in a simulator, and an instructor had put the proof on a classroom wall for everyone to see. The Academy's response to gossip was, as it had always been, to schedule a practical. The quarterly field assessment was already on the calendar, 3 weeks out. A full-day exercise conducted in the Academy's terrain simulation dome, a massive enclosed environment capable of reproducing everything from Arctic tundra to dense urban ruin, where cadets were assessed on live tactical performance rather than classroom theory. Cadets were graded individually but assigned into small tactical teams for the exercise, and team assignments were, in theory, randomized. In practice, Commandant HFY Volume 50, who ran the Academy with the particular efficiency of someone who had spent 30 years as a fleet officer before taking the post, had looked at the seminar incident report that crossed her desk and made a specific, deliberate decision about the team assignments for this quarter's assessment. She put Rin Calder and Illyra-san on the same team. "You want to know what he's actually capable of," she told Vask, when he asked about the assignment during a staff briefing. "You don't ask him. You put him next to your best cadet and see what happens when neither of them can hide behind a number anymore." The exercise scenario, drawn at random from a rotating library of 200 simulated engagements, was a hostage extraction under contested urban conditions. A 4-cadet team inserting into a simulated conflict zone to recover simulated noncombatants from a building held by an opposing force of AI-controlled hostiles, under a time limit, with the simulation dome's environmental systems configured to produce genuine sensory stress, reduced visibility, structural instability, ambient combat noise loud enough to require shouted communication at close range. The team's other 2 members were a Darini cadet named Brask, solid and methodical, and a younger human cadet, Petra Voss, in her 2nd year, who had never spoken more than a few words to Rin despite sharing a dormitory wing with him for 6 weeks. Illyra was, by rank and seniority, team lead. It was the first time in 3 years that anyone on her team had a service record that could plausibly have made her the subordinate one, and everyone in the observation gallery above the dome, including, unofficially, most of the 4th-year class who had heard about the seminar and found reasons to be present, understood exactly what they were watching for. Part 6, The Dome. The scenario opened with the team inserting through a breach point on the northern edge of a 12-story simulated structure, smoke and structural dust reducing visibility to under 10 meters, the ambient audio track layering in distant weapons fire and the groan of a building under stress. Illyra called the initial formation, Brask on point given his mass and the dome's throughput on breaching doors, Petra on rear security, herself and Rin splitting the middle to cover the interior approach. It went well for the first 4 minutes, which was, by the standards of the scenario library, longer than most teams managed. Then the simulation's AI opposition force, which adapted its behavior in real time based on team performance, adjusted its approach. Splitting into 2 elements instead of the single group the team's initial intel had suggested, one holding the hostage position and one moving to flank the team's breach point and cut off their extraction route. Illyra caught the flanking movement on her sensor feed 11 seconds after it began and called the correction over comm, redirecting Brask to cover the flank while she and Rin pushed forward toward the hostage position. It was, by every standard the Academy taught, the correct call. Fast recognition, appropriate reallocation of force, no hesitation. It was also, Rin said over comm a beat later, about 4 seconds too slow, because the flanking element's approach vector put them on a collision course with the team's only viable extraction corridor, and covering the flank at the breach point meant Brask would be pinned there when the extraction window opened, rather than free to move with the rest of the team. "We hold the flank at the breach and we lose Brask's mobility for extraction," Rin said, his voice level over the comm static and the layered noise of the simulated firefight starting up around the hostage position. We can still make the timeline if we let the flank close the gap and take them in the stairwell instead. Narrower approach, they lose their numbers advantage, and it keeps us on a straight line back to the extraction point. Illyra, mid-stride, sensor feed still updating, ran the calculation in under 2 seconds, a genuinely impressive processing speed under live sensory stress, the kind of speed that had made her the top-ranked cadet in her class for 3 straight years, and arrived, half a second after Rin had already said it, at the same conclusion. "Redirect," she said over calm brask, "fall back to the east stairwell, let them come to you. Petra, hold rear security, watch our extraction line." A half-second pause. Calder's call. Execute. It was a small thing, in the grand accounting of the exercise, 2 words acknowledging where the correction had come from, delivered without visible cost to her authority, without any hesitation that would have cost the team time they didn't have. But Vask, watching from the observation gallery with Commandant Volume 50 beside him, noted it, because it was the first time in 3 years of watching Illyra-san run tactical exercises that he had heard her attribute a call to someone else in real time, under pressure, rather than simply absorbing the input and issuing it as her own. The stairwell engagement went the way Rin had predicted. The flanking element, forced into a bottleneck by the narrower approach, lost the numerical advantage that had made them dangerous in open terrain, and Brask's mass and the confined space turned what should have been a 4-against-2 disadvantage into a fight the team's biggest cadet could hold on his own for the 90 seconds it took the rest of the team to reach and clear the hostage position. The hostage extraction itself took another 6 minutes of the kind of close coordination movement that the observation gallery, packed by this point with most of the 4th-year class and several instructors who had heard what was happening and abandoned their offices to watch, recognized as genuinely exceptional team performance. Not flawless, not without moments of friction and recalculation, but tight in a way that 4 cadets who had never worked together before had no business achieving on a first attempt. They cleared the scenario with 11 seconds left on the extraction timer, the tightest margin the observation gallery had seen in a hostage scenario in at least 2 years, and the dome's simulation systems cut to the debrief lighting to a silence that, this time, was not shocked or uncertain. It was the specific quiet of a room that had just watched something click into place. Part 7, The Debrief. Commandant Volume 50 ran the debrief herself, which was unusual enough that everyone in the room understood its significance before she said a word. "Cadet-san," she said, when the tactical review had run its course and the team stood at ease in the debrief room, still in their exercise gear, "your team lead performance was exemplary. Fast recognition, correct reallocation of resources under the initial flanking maneuver, and," she paused, and there was something almost approving in the pause itself, "the willingness to redirect a call mid-execution when a better option presented itself. That's a harder skill to teach than tactical recognition. Most cadets at your ranking have to unlearn the instinct to protect their own call before they can develop it." Illyra, to her credit, didn't deflect the moment or perform false modesty. "The redirect wasn't mine, Commandant. Cadet Calder identified the extraction bottleneck before I'd finished processing the flank." "I'm aware," Volume 50 said. "I watched the sensor timestamps. 4 seconds is not a small gap at that stage of an engagement, Cadet-san, and you closed it fast enough that it didn't cost the team anything. That's the skill I'm commending. Recognizing you're wrong before it matters is worth considerably more than being right in the first place." She turned to Rin. "Cadet Calder. Your tactical read was accurate and your communication of it was clear and fast, which is the part cadets from your background typically struggle with. Frontier operational experience tends to produce excellent instinct and poor articulation, because there's rarely time to explain yourself in the field. You didn't have that problem. Where did you learn to communicate a call that fast?" Rin considered the question for a moment with the same quality of genuine consideration he'd given Illyra's question 3 weeks earlier. 4 seconds is a long time to explain something when the alternative is 4 people dying because nobody understood what you meant, he said. You learn to say it short, or you stop getting listened to. Volume 50 held his gaze for a moment, and something in her expression suggested she was filing that answer away somewhere it would matter later. Dismissed. Good work, all 4 of you. Part 8, Halvern's Reach. The team didn't disperse immediately once they left the debrief room. It was Petra, the youngest of them, who asked the question that had clearly been building in her since the seminar footage had circulated 3 weeks earlier. The question nobody had quite worked up the nerve to ask Rin directly. The reactor thing, she said, as they walked together toward the transit hub that connected the training wing to the dormitories. The valve. You went in alone. Why didn't you wait for backup? Rin was quiet for a few steps before he answered, and when he did, his voice had lost some of the flat procedural quality it carried in classrooms and debriefs. Something more tired underneath it, the sound of a subject he didn't particularly enjoy revisiting but didn't feel entitled to avoid either. There wasn't a backup, he said. Halvern's Reach had 11 militia and about 40 people total with any technical training on the reactor systems, and every one of them was 3 kilometers away running the actual evacuation. I was the only armed personnel close enough to reach the valve inside the time window. If I'd waited for someone with proper reactor training to suit up and get out there, the containment would have breached before they arrived. So it was me, or it was 412 people in the residential domes. That's not really an answer to why, Brask said, in his slow, careful Darini cadence. That's an answer to how it was possible. Why is a different question. Rin looked at him for a moment, and something that might have been the beginning of a real smile moved at the corner of his mouth, not much, but more than Vask or Illyra had seen from him in 3 weeks of shared classes. My little sister was in Dome 4, he said. She was 9. So I guess the honest answer is that I didn't really do the math on it. I just went. Nobody said anything for a moment. Illyra, walking a half-step behind the others, found herself looking at him with an expression she hadn't used on anyone at this academy in 3 years, not calculation, not competition, something closer to the beginning of understanding. Halvern's Reach doesn't have a formal defense contract with the Coalition, she said eventually. It wasn't a question either, but there was a different quality to it than her question in the seminar had carried. I looked it up after the seminar. It's outside the standard patrol perimeter. You've been defending that settlement essentially alone for 4 years, with no institutional backing at all. We've got the militia, Rin said. 11 people. We're not alone, exactly. We're just far away. That's the same thing. Some days, Illyra said, and for the first time since the seminar, there was no edge in her voice at all, just a plain acknowledgement of something she was still working out how to hold. Part 9. The second question. The rest of the term did not proceed the way the first 3 weeks had suggested it might. The informal hierarchy that had shaped the class's treatment of Rin Calder didn't collapse overnight, institutions and the people inside them rarely changed that cleanly. But it bent, steadily, under the accumulating weight of a cadet who kept demonstrating, in seminar after seminar and exercise after exercise, that the numbers in his file had not been the ceiling of what he brought to the room. They had been, if anything, the floor. Illyra-san stopped needling him in seminars and started, instead, doing something she had apparently never done with any other cadet in 3 years, she started studying with him. It began as a practical matter. The 2 of them working through a joint tactics assignment after the hostage extraction exercise, comparing notes on the stairwell redirect for a formal after-action report the commandant had requested from both of them, and continued past the point where the assignment justified it. Vask, observing the pattern from a discrete institutional distance, noted in his private assessment of the class that Cadet San's seminar performance had improved noticeably over the following 2 months, not because her tactical instincts had changed, but because she had, for the first time in her academy career, acquired the habit of testing her own conclusions against someone whose instincts came from a different kind of pressure than the simulation dome could produce. Rin, for his part, remained largely as he had been from the first day, unhurried, precise, uninterested in the social credit that had begun accumulating around him. He still ran solo drills after the scheduled sessions ended. He still answered questions in class with the same flat certainty, right or admittedly unsure, no hedge in between. But something had shifted in the small daily texture of his days. Cadets who had crossed the common lounge to avoid sitting near him in the third week now saved him a seat in the ninth. The Vantar cadet who had laughed sharply and then caught herself in Vask's seminar apologized to him, awkwardly, a month later, and he accepted it with the same unbothered ease he seemed to bring to everything, which somehow made the apology land harder than if he'd made her sit with the discomfort of it. Near the end of the term, in a private meeting that Instructor Vask had requested with Commandant Volume 50 to discuss placement recommendations for the graduating cohort, the conversation turned, as it inevitably would, to Cadet Calder. 11 graduates from his species in 19 years, Volume 50 said, reviewing the file on her desk terminal. And every placement committee we've run in that time has quietly steered human graduates toward frontier logistics postings. Solid, unglamorous, low visibility. Nobody ever explicitly decided that was policy. It just kept happening, year after year, because nobody wanted to be the first to push a human candidate toward a command track and be wrong about it. He's not going to end up in frontier logistics, Vask said. You know that. I do, Volume 50 said. The question is what we do about it, and how loudly we do it. There's a version of this where we quietly place him somewhere appropriately significant and let his record speak for itself over the next decade. And there's a version where we make it very clear, in front of the entire graduating class, exactly why the placement committee made the call it made. Which version are you leaning toward? Volume 50 was quiet for a moment, looking at the case study footage still queued on her terminal from the seminar report Vask had filed weeks earlier. The reactor chamber, the valve, the timestamp reading 9 minutes and 40 seconds. I spent 30 years in Fleet Command believing the Academy's species-blind policy actually meant something, she said. I'd like to spend whatever years I have left running this place making sure it does. Loud version. Part 10, Graduation. The graduation ceremony for Rin Calder's cohort took place 6 months later, in the Academy's main assembly hall, under the full weight of Station Cathas's assembled command staff, visiting fleet officers, and 340 cadets from the classes below who would, in their own turn, eventually stand where the graduating cohort now stood. Placement announcements were, by tradition, read in reverse order of class ranking. Lowest to highest, building toward the top performers as the final announcements of the ceremony, a structure designed to hold the room's attention until the end. Illara San's name came forth from last, placed to a command track posting on a frontier defense cruiser, a placement that drew genuine applause from a room that had watched her earn it across 4 years. Rin Calder's name came last. The placement, when Commandant Volume 50 read it aloud, was not a frontier logistics posting. It was a tactical command track assignment to the Coalition's 4th Fleet Advisory Staff, the kind of placement that 11 previous human graduates had never come close to receiving, the kind that typically went to the very top of a graduating class's most conventionally decorated cadets. Volume 50 did not simply read the placement and move on. She set the data slate down and looked out at the assembled hall for a moment before speaking further, and the room, sensing something outside the ceremony's usual rhythm, went quiet in a way graduation ceremonies rarely managed. 19 years ago, she said, this academy admitted its first human cadet, under a species-blind policy this institution has claimed to uphold for 160 years. In 19 years, that policy has produced 11 graduates from that species, every one of them placed, without exception, into logistics and support roles. I want to be honest with this room about why. It was never written policy. No committee ever voted to limit human placements. It happened because 160 years of tradition builds an expectation, and expectations are heavier than any written rule, and it is easier, always, to place someone where they will confirm what you already believe than to place them where they might prove you wrong. She looked out at the graduating cohort, and then, briefly, at Rin, standing near the end of the line with the same unhurried stillness he'd carried through every seminar and every exercise of the past year. Cadet Calder's placement was not decided because of a single seminar, or a single exercise, though I understand both of those have become something of a legend among this year's underclassmen already. It was decided because his instructors, across an entire term, watched him meet every standard this institution claims to hold, and several it does not officially measure at all. Because being extraordinary quietly, without asking anyone to notice, is a harder thing to sustain than being extraordinary loudly, and this cohort watched him do it for a year without once making it about anything other than the work in front of him. She picked the slate back up. This institution does not always live up to its own stated principles. Today, I intend for it to. Congratulations, Cadet Calder. The applause that followed was not the polite, dutiful kind that had greeted most of the placements read before it. It built, cadet by cadet, instructor by instructor, until it filled the hall in a way that Rin, standing there with the same steady light brown eyes that had never changed with what was happening around him, only with what he was thinking, seemed, for the first time in a year, genuinely unprepared for. Epilogue. Instructor Vask kept a private note in his personal files, separate from the official performance records the Academy retained, a habit he'd developed over 11 years of teaching as a way of remembering the students who mattered beyond what a transcript could capture. Most years, the note was a line or two. For Rin Calder's cohort, it ran longer. Cadet Calder arrived already capable of everything this institution exists to teach, and he spent a year here anyway, without complaint, without ego, without once suggesting that the coursework was beneath the experience he'd already lived. When Cadet San tested him in the third week, he answered the way he answered everything, honestly, completely, without performance. It took the rest of us considerably longer to catch up to what he already understood, which is that the numbers in a file are never the whole story, and the people who wait to be asked before they show you who they are will always be worth the wait. 11 graduates in 19 years, placed quietly, unremarkably, into roles this institution decided, without ever writing it down, that their species belonged in. I don't know how many of them could have stood where Calder stood at graduation. I suspect more of them than we gave the chance to find out. Already teaching it, the day I met him. I hope this academy spends the next 19 years learning to notice sooner. End.